The Mysterious Sketch. Opposite St. Sebald Chapel in Nuremberg, at the corner of Trabas Street, there is a little tavern. It is narrow and high. The windows, if now as then, are covered with a heavy coat of dust, and the sharp gable end is surmounted by the Virgin in plaster. It was there that I passed the most joyless days of my life. I had gone to Nuremberg to study the German masters, but being poorly supplied with money, I was compelled to paint portraits. And what portraits! Fat old women with their cats on their laps, big-wigged aldermen, portly burgomasters in their three-cornered hats, the whole illuminated with ochre and vermilion by the handful. From portraits I descended to sketches, and from sketches to silhouettes. Nothing makes life a greater burden than to have your landlord, with his weazen face, his shrill voice, and impudent air, come to you every day and assail your sensibilities with, "Well, sir, well, am I ever to see the color of your money again? Do you know how much your little bill amounts to now? No idea, probably, don't want to have. My fine gentleman eats, drinks, and sleeps calmly, as if all the world were his own. Your bill amounts to 200 florins, sir. A mere bagatelle, I know, sir, but I could make good use of it just now, if I had it." He who had not been forced to listen to the chanting of a gamut of this construction can have no idea of its effect on the human mind. Love of art, imagination, enthusiasm for the beautiful, everything poetic and ennobling in the realms of thought, is scattered to the winds by a harangue of the sort. You become awkward, timid, limp. You lose all your feeling of personal dignity, and seek to escape the gaze of your fellows. One night, being, as was often the case, without a kreutzer and menaced with imprisonment by the worthy Rapp, I resolved to bankrupt him by cutting my throat. While I sat opposite the window occupied with this agreeable thought, my mind wandered off into innumerable philosophic reflections, more or less edifying. What is man? I asked myself. An omnivorous animal, his jaws provided with canines, incisors, and molars, sufficiently prove it. The canines are made to tear, the incisors to cut, and the molars to crush such animal and vegetable substances as constitute his food. But when he has nothing to masticate, the creature man is a veritable superplenitude in nature, a fifth wheel to the coach. Such were my reflections. I did not dare to touch my razor for fear that the force of my logic would inspire me with the courage to make an end of it. After having argued for some time in this manner, I blew out my candle and postponed the continuation till the next day. This abominable Rapp had completely brutalized me. In my art nothing but silhouettes, and yet my uppermost desire was to have the money necessary to rid myself of his odious importunities. But that night a singular change came over my mental condition. I awoke about 1 o'clock, lighted my lamp, and, enveloping myself in my well-worn dressing-gown, I rapidly threw upon paper a sketch à la Flamande, something strange and weird that was totally unlike my ordinary conceptions. Imagine a somber courtyard, enclosed by high, dilapidated walls, which are provided with hooks 7 or 8 feet from the ground. One readily sees that it represents a butcher's yard. At the left there is a sort of lattice partition, through which you see the carcass of an ox suspended by pulleys on a heavy framework. Sluggish streams of blood flow over the flagstones toward a gutter already well filled with all sorts of debris. At the farther side of the enclosure there is a shed. Under the shed, a pile of wood. On the wood, a ladder, a few bundles of straw, some coils of rope, a chicken coop, and an old unused rabbit cage. How came these details to present themselves to my imagination? I know not. I had no analogous reminiscence, and nevertheless every stroke of the pencil had the appearance of contributing its share toward the representing of a reality. Nothing was wanting to give the sketch the semblance of truth. But at the right there was a corner that remained unfilled. I was at a loss to know what to put there. At that point it seemed to me that something moved. All at once I saw a foot, or rather the sole of a foot. Despite this improbable position, I followed the inspiration without pausing to consider. This foot was attached to a leg, and on the leg the muscles of which seemed to be vigorously contracted, there soon floated the tattered skirt of a dress. In short, an old woman, wan and disheveled, appeared, stretched out beside an old well, struggling to free herself from the grasp of a hand that held fast to her throat. It was a murder scene that I was sketching. Horror-stricken, I let the pencil fall from my hand. The woman in this perilous situation, her features distorted with terror, her hands grasping the arm of the murderer, made me tremble with fear. I could not look at her. But the man, he to whom the arm belonged, I could not see him. It was impossible for me to finish the sketch. "I am tired," said I to myself, my forehead dripping with perspiration. "I have only this figure to finish, and I will do it tomorrow. Then it will be easy enough." With this I returned to bed. In a little while I was sound asleep. The next morning I rose at an unusually early hour. I had barely got ready to resume work on my nocturnal sketch when there came a gentle rap at my door. "Come in." The door opened. An elderly man, tall and lean and neatly dressed in black, appeared on my threshold. His mien, with his small, deep-set eyes and his big hooked nose, surmounted by a high, bony forehead, was dignified and stern. He saluted me with ceremonious gravity. "Monsieur Christian Venus, the painter," said he. "At your service, sir." He bowed again, saying, "The Baron Frederick von Sprechtel." The appearance of the rich dilettante von Sprechtel, judge of the criminal court, in my garret, very nearly robbed me of my self-possession. I involuntarily cast a furtive glance at my old worm-eaten furniture, my torn wallpaper and soiled floor. I felt humiliated by the dilapidated condition of the surroundings in which my distinguished visitor found me. But the Baron seemed to take notice of these details. He seated himself before my table and resumed. "Master Venus," said he, "I come—" But at this moment his eyes fell upon the unfinished sketch. He stopped in the middle of the sentence. I was seated on the side of my bed. The sudden attention this august personage gave to one of my productions made my heart beat with an indefinable apprehension. He looked at it intently for a minute or two. Then, turning toward me, he asked in a very earnest tone, "Are you the author of this sketch, sir?" "I am." "The price of it?" "I never sell my sketches. It is the first step toward a painting." "Ah," said he, as he picked up the paper with the ends of his long yellow fingers. He took a lens out of his waistcoat pocket and set to studying the sketch in detail. The sun at this hour shone obliquely into my garret. Von Sprechtel was silent. The aquilinity of his big thin nose seemed to me to have suddenly increased. His heavy brows contracted, and his long pointed chin had taken a turn upward, making 1,000 little wrinkles in his thin colorless cheeks. The silence was so profound that I could distinctly hear the buzzing of an unfortunate fly that struggled to escape from the toils of a spider's web. "The dimensions of the picture you propose to paint, Master Venus?" said he, without looking up. 3 feet by 4. "The price?" 50 ducats. The Baron von Sprechtel laid the sketch down on the table and drew from his pocket a long green silk purse. 50 ducats, said he, slipping the rings of his purse. 50 ducats. There they are. I could hardly believe my eyes. The Baron rose, bade me good morning, and descended the stairs, making his heavy ivory-headed cane heard on each step as he went down. Then, recovering from my stupor, it occurred to me that I had not thanked him, whereupon I plunged down my 5 flights almost as fast as gravitation would take me. But arrived at the lower door, I looked for my generous patron in vain. He was nowhere to be seen. "Huh," said I to myself, "this is very strange." And I hastened back to my garret. 2. The unexpected visit from the munificent von Sprechtel quite bewildered me. I was ecstatic. "Yesterday," said I to myself as I contemplated the pile of ducats shining in the sun, "yesterday I sinfully considered the advisability of cutting my throat, and all for the want of a few miserable florins. How fortunate that I did not open my razor! If ever I am again tempted to end this existence, I will profit by experience and put it off till tomorrow." After making these wholesome reflections, I sat down to finish my sketch. A few strokes of the pencil was all it required. But these few strokes I found it impossible to make. I had lost the thread of my inspiration. Cudgel my brain as I would, I could get nothing from it that harmonized any better with the rest of the sketch than a figure of Raphael would with the frequenters of one of Turnier's pothouses. While I was thus absorbed, I was suddenly interrupted by Rapp, who, as he was in the habit of doing, entered my room without rapping. As his astonished eyes fell upon my pile of ducats, he cried out in a tone that enraged me beyond all control. "So, Mr. Painter, I catch you, do I? Perhaps you'll tell me now you have no money." As he spoke, he came forward with his fingers crooked, as though about to seize something, and with a certain nervous agitation that the sight of gold so often produces in the avaricious. For a moment I was stupefied, but the recollection of the indignities I had been compelled to submit to from the fellow, his greedy look and his insulting smile, were more than sufficient to arouse me. I sprang toward him, seized him by the shoulders, and, quick as thought, put him out of the room, slamming the door in his vulgar face. But no sooner was he outside the room than the old curmudgeon began to cry out at the top of his voice, "My money! Pay me my money, you thief! Give me my money!" My neighbors came out of their rooms and added to the confusion by shouting, "What's the matter? Who's the thief? What's all this?" Before the worthy Rapp could satisfy any of these inquiries, I flung my door open, and by a well-directed kick sent him heels over head down the first flight of stairs. "That's what's the matter," I cried, and returned to my den, bolting the door securely, while my neighbors made the house resound with loud peals of laughter. I was well satisfied with myself. I felt truly triumphant. The episode had put new life into me. I returned to my sketch and had just finished it quite to my satisfaction when my attention was arrested by an unusual noise. It reminded me of the striking of the butts of muskets on the pavement. I looked out of the window and saw 3 gendarmes in full uniform, leaning on their carbines, and standing directly before the street door. "The devil," said I to myself, not a little terrified. "Have I perhaps broken some of the fellow's bones?" And now see the inconsistency of the human mind. I, who yesterday cared not a button, as I thought, whether I lived or not, today trembled in every nerve at the thought that I had, perchance, killed my landlord, and should be hanged for it. The staircase became the scene of confused and ominous sounds, the steps of feet encased in heavy boots, the clanking of arms, and tones of voices which at that moment struck me as being of bass the basest. Suddenly someone tried my door. It was fastened, which seemed to give rise to a general clamor. But soon a voice was heard above the others. It cried out, "Open in the name of the law!" I arose to find that my knees had suddenly become very weak. "Open the door!" the voice repeated. It occurred to me that I might escape over the roof, but I had hardly thrust my head out of the window when I was seized with a sort of vertigo, and quickly withdrew it. I had taken in at a glance the windows below me with their shining panes, their flower pots, their bird cages, and their gratings, and still lower, the balcony, lower still, the street lamp, then the sign of the red cask, and finally the 3 shining bayonets that only awaited my fall to spit me as they would a piece of cheese on a toasting fork. On the roof of the house across the street there was a big cat hiding behind a chimney and watching a little band of sparrows that were engaged in settling their differences in the gutter. One cannot imagine with what clearness and rapidity the human eye takes in a situation with all its minutest details when the visual powers are stimulated by fear. At the third summons, "Open the door, or we shall force it!" Seeing that escape was impossible, I slipped back the bolt. In an instant, a stalwart fellow seized me by the collar, and a little pompous official whose breath was offensively odorous of alcohol announced, "Sir, you are my prisoner." He wore a bottle-green single-breasted coat, buttoned to the chin, and a high hat patterned after a stovepipe. He had heavy side whiskers, rings on all his fingers, and was called Passoff. He was the chief of police. 5 more bullet-headed minions of the law waited for me on the stairs. "What do you want of me?" I asked Passoff. "Downstairs," he cried as he made a sign to his underlings who had me by the collar to drag me in that direction. While his order was being obeyed, he, with the assistance of the others, hastily searched my room, turning everything topsy-turvy and inside out. I descended the stairs, supported on each side like one in the last stage of consumption. They thrust me into a cab between two brawny fellows, armed with heavy clubs secured to their wrists with leather straps. I was glad they drove away without delay, as in a very few minutes we should have had all the idlers in the neighborhood about us. As soon as I had sufficient control over my organs of speech, I turned to one of my guardians, the one whose mien seemed to me the least forbidding, and asked what I had done. "Hans, he asks what he has done," says he to his comrade. Their laughter fairly chilled my blood. It was not long before a shadow enveloped us, and the sound of the horses' feet echoed under an archway. We were at the entrance of the Raspel house. It is there that one may say, "Dans cet entre, je vois fort bien comme l'on entre, et ne vois point comme on en sort." Footnote. I see very well how one gets into this den or cave, but I do not see how one gets out. End footnote. All is not rose-colored in this world. From the persecutions of Rap, I fell into a dungeon, from which it is only the minority who have the good fortune to escape. Dark, spacious courts, windows in long lines like a hospital, and furnished with grating. Not the smallest clump of verdure, not even the leaf of a bush or a spear of grass. Such was my new lodging place. It was enough to make one pull out his hair by the handfuls. The police officers and the jailer put me provisionally into a sort of anteroom. The jailer, as well as I could remember, was called Caspar Schlussel, with his gray woolen cap, his pipe in his mouth, and his bunch of keys at his waist. He reminded me of the god Hibu of the Caribs. He had the same large eyes with a yellow circle that see in the night, a nose like a comma, while his neck disappeared between his shoulders. Schlussel locked me in as mechanically as one locks his bureau drawer, his thoughts the while seeming to be far away. As for me, I stood fully 10 minutes with my hands behind my back, looking down at the floor. "Rap," said I to myself, after taking a complete survey of the situation. Rap cried out as he fell, "I am killed, I am killed," but he did not say by whom. I will swear it was my neighbor, the old merchant with the green spectacles, and he will be hanged in my place. This idea I found very consoling, and I consequently breathed more freely. I now proceeded to examine my prison, or rather my cell. It had been newly whitewashed, and there were no sketches on its walls except in one corner, where a gallows had been crudely outlined by my predecessor. Light was admitted by a bullseye some 9 or 10 feet from the floor. As for the furniture, it was limited to a bunch of straw and a bench. I sat down on the straw and clasped my hands around my knees in the most unenviable frame of mind imaginable. I had not been long seated when it occurred to me that Rap, before breathing his last, may have denounced me. The thought brought me quickly to my feet. I coughed involuntarily and imagined I felt a choking sensation, as though the hempen cord were already round my neck. Just at this moment, my hallucinations were interrupted by footsteps in the passageway. Schlussel opened my door and bade me follow him. He was still assisted by the 2 officers who had had the honor of lodging me in prison. They received me with a triumphant smile as I issued forth, as though they were proud of their achievement. I seemed to take no notice of them, but, summoning all my fortitude, I followed with a tolerably firm stop. We passed through long galleries, lighted from distance to distance by small grated windows. On the way I saw, behind massive bars, the famous Jick-Jack, who was to pay the penalty of his crimes the next day on the gallows. He was in a straitjacket and was gaily singing, "Je suis le roi de ces montagnes." When he saw me, he cried out, "Ho, comrade, I'll keep a place for you at my right." The 2 policemen and the god Hibu looked at one another and smiled, while I felt the goose flesh creep down my back and shoulders to my waist. 3. Schlussel led the way to a large room furnished with rows of benches arranged in a semicircle. The aspect of this spacious hall, deserted as it was, with its 2 high grated windows, its image of the Savior in old brown oak with his arms extended and his head inclined toward one shoulder, inspired me with a sort of religious fear that harmonized with my situation. All my ideas of false accusation disappeared, and my lips involuntarily murmured a prayer. I had not prayed for a long time. Misfortune always brings a submissive frame of mind. Before me, on an elevated seat, sat two men with their backs toward the windows, which put their faces in the shade. I nevertheless recognized von Sprechtel by his aquiline profile. The other was a stout, round-faced man, with short, pudgy hands. They were both in judicial robes. Below them sat the clerk of the court, Conrad. He was writing at a small table and stroking his cheek with the feather end of his pen. When I arrived, he leaned back in his chair and seemed to study my face with deep interest. I was shown to a seat when von Sprechtel asked me, in a loud, distinct voice, "Christian Venus, where did you get this sketch?" He held up my nocturnal sketch, then in his possession. It was passed to me. After looking at it a moment, I replied, "I made it." There was a prolonged silence. The clerk wrote down my answer. As I listened to his pen going over the paper, I thought, what is the meaning of the question they have just asked me? What relation has my sketch to the kick I gave Rapp? "You drew the sketch, you say?" said von Sprechtel. "Very well. Where is the scene?" "Nowhere in reality, but only in my imagination." "Do you mean to tell us that you imagined all these details? That you did not copy them somewhere?" "That is just what I want to say. This is purely a fancy sketch. I may have seen somewhere at some time a courtyard similar to the one represented here, but the details are all imaginary." "Christian Venus," said the judge in solemn tone, "I counsel you to reflect and to tell the truth. Believe me, it will be better for you in the end." Indignant at having my veracity called in question, I replied with some spirit, "I have said, sir, that this is entirely a work of the imagination, of my imagination, and I repeat it." "Write down his answer," said von Sprechtel to the clerk. Again that ominous pen went scratching over the paper. "And this woman," continued the judge, "this woman who is being killed at the mouth of this well, did you imagine this detail with the rest?" "Certainly." "You have never witnessed such a scene?" "Never." Von Sprechtel rose as though he was exasperated. Then, resuming his seat, he seemed to consult with his colleague. The mysterious whispering in front of me, the three men standing behind me, the silence that reigned in the hall, everything combined to make me shudder. What does all this mean? What am I accused of? I asked myself. Suddenly von Sprechtel said to my guardians, "Reconduct your prisoner to the vehicle in which you brought him here. We will all go to Metzer Street." Then, turning to me, he added, "Christian Venus, you are in a perilous situation. You should remember that, if the law is inflexible, there still remains to you the mercy of heaven, which you may merit by confessing your crime." These words stunned me like a blow with a hammer. I threw up my arms and fell back, crying out, "Ah, what a frightful dream!" The next moment I was unconscious, having swooned. When I regained my senses, I was being driven slowly through one of the principal streets. Another vehicle preceded us. The two servants of the law were still watching over me. One of them, on the way, offered a pinch of snuff to his confrere. I mechanically reached out my fingers toward the box, but he drew it away, as though he feared there was a contamination in my touch. My cheeks reddened from shame and indignation, and I turned away to conceal my emotion. "If you don't look out," said the man with the snuff-box, "we'll have to put a pair of bracelets on you. Do you hear?" The wretch! I could have strangled him. Under the circumstances, however, I deemed it wiser to remain silent than to make the attempt. In a few minutes, the two carriages came to a stop. One of my guardians got out, while the other held me by the collar till his comrade was ready to receive me, when he pushed me rudely toward him. These precautions to retain possession of my person augured nothing good. Still, I was far from imagining the exceeding gravity of the accusation that hung over me, when an alarming circumstance opened my eyes and threw me into despair. They had led me, or rather pushed me, into a low, narrow passageway, with an irregular, broken pavement. Along the side of the wall there was a pool of yellowish water that exhaled a most disagreeable odor. The passage was quite dark. Beyond it was evident there was a courtyard. As I advanced, I felt myself more and more possessed with an indescribable terror. It was a feeling such as I had never experienced before. There was something supernatural about it. It seemed to me a sort of nightmare. I hesitated at every step. "Go on! Go on!" cried one of the ruffians behind me, at the same time pushing me rudely forward. But what was my amazement when I saw at the end of the passage the court I had sketched the preceding night, with its walls furnished with books, its piles of old rubbish, its chicken coop, and its rabbit cage. Not a window, large or small, high or low, not a broken pane, in short, not a single detail had been omitted. I was overwhelmed by this strange revelation. Near the well stood the two judges, von Sprechtel and Richter. At their feet, the old woman lay stretched out on her back. Her long white hair was spread out over the pavement. Her face was deep purple. Her eyes were half open, and her tongue half protruded from her mouth. The spectacle she presented was indescribably horrible. "Well," said von Sprechtel, in a tone of the utmost gravity, "what have you to say, sir?" I made no response. "Do you confess to having thrown this woman, Teresa Becker, into this well after having strangled her in order to rob her of her money?" "I strangle this woman? I rob her of her money? Never! I never knew her, never saw her till now. Never, as heaven is my judge." "That is sufficient," said he, and without adding a word he left the yard with his confrere. My guardians now seemed to think they were justified in putting handcuffs on me. They took me back to the Raspel house. I was completely crushed. What to think I knew not. Even my conscience troubled me. I almost thought that I had murdered the old woman, but how? When? My brain was confused. Everything seemed to dance before my eyes. It was evident that the two policemen already saw me on the road to the gallows. I will not attempt to describe the agony of mind I suffered that night as I sat on my bunch of straw, the bull's-eye window before and above me, and the gallows in perspective, and heard from hour to hour the watchman cry out, "1 o'clock and all is well! 2 o'clock and all is well!" and so on the night through. Everyone will be able to form some idea of such a night. It is not true that it is better to suffer innocently than being guilty. For the soul, yes, but for the body there is no difference. On the contrary, it curses its lot, struggles and tries to escape, knowing that its role ends with the cord. Add to all this its regrets at not having sufficiently enjoyed life, and at having listened to the soul when it preached abstinence. "Ah, if I had only known," it cried, "you would not have led me about by the nose with your big words and fine phrases. You would not have allured me with your seductive promises. I would have had many a happy hour lost to me now forever. Be temperate, govern your passions, said you. I was temperate, I did govern my passions. What have I gained by it? They are going to hang me and you. Afterward you will be apostrophized as the sublime and stoical soul that fell a martyr to the errors of the law and its ministers. Of me, not a word will be said." Such were the reflections of my poor body in my extremity. The day finally began to appear. At first, pale and undecided, it shed a vague glimmer on my bull's-eye window. Then, little by little, the sun neared the horizon. Without, everything began to be astir. It chanced to be market day, Friday. I could hear the carts pass, loaded with vegetables, and sometimes catch a few words of the rustics who were driving them. I could hear them opening the market outside. Then came the arranging of the benches. Finally, it was broad day, and going and coming and murmur of voices told me that the crowd without must be quite large. With the light, my courage in some measure returned. Some of my gloomy forebodings disappeared, and something akin to hope usurped their place. I felt a desire to look out. Other prisoners before me had managed to get up to the bull's-eye. They had dug holes in the wall in order to accomplish the task more easily, or rather to make it possible. I climbed up in my turn, and when I was seated most uncomfortably on the edge of the oval around the window and could look out at the crowd, the life, the movement. Abundant tears ran down my cheeks. I thought no longer of putting an end to my earthly existence. I felt a desire to live and to get back into the busy world again. Ah, said I to myself, to live is to be happy. Let them harness me to a wheelbarrow or attach a ball and chain to my leg. Let them do no matter what to me so that they only let me live. The old market, with its pointed roof supported by heavy pillars, offered a most interesting spectacle. Old women seated beside their piles of vegetables, their coops of poultry, and their baskets of eggs. Behind them were ranged the dealers in old clothes, Jews with complexions resembling the color of old boxwood. Then there were the butchers, with their bare arms, cutting and sawing their meats, countrymen with their broad-brimmed felt hats pushed back on their heads, calm and grave, their hands behind their backs, resting on their evergreen sticks and tranquilly smoking their pipes. Add to all this the noise and turmoil of the crowd, the various tones of the voices, and the expressive gestures which convey to the distant observer the nature of the discussion, and so perfectly reflect the character of the speaker. In short, the scene fascinated me, and despite my unenviable position, I felt happy in the thought that I still lived. While I was thus occupied looking out of my window, a man, a butcher, passed. He was bent forward and carried a large quarter of beef on his shoulders. His arms were bare and extended above his head. His hair was long, like that of the Sicambrian of Salvator, and so fell about his face that I could not distinguish his features. And yet, at the first glance, I involuntarily shuddered. "It is he!" I exclaimed aloud. All the blood in my body seemed suddenly to have taken leave of me. There was apparently none in my face or extremities. I hastened down from the window with all possible expedition, feeling chilled to the very ends of my fingers. "It is he! He is there!" I stammered. "And I am here to expiate his crime. Great heaven, what shall I do? What shall I do?" An idea, an inspiration from heaven flashed upon my mind. I reached for my crayon, which I providentially chanced to have in my coat pocket. Then I mounted to my seat again, and set to work to sketch the scene of the murder, with a nerve that seemed to me truly superhuman. There was no more uncertainty. Every stroke of the pencil told. I had my man. I saw him. He was there before me. At 10 o'clock the jailer entered my cell. His owl-like impassibility gave way to an exhibition of something akin to admiration. "Is it possible?" said he. "Up, and in such good spirits." "Go, bring me my judges," said I in a triumphant tone as I gave the last touches to my sketch. "I wish to see them here." "They are waiting for you," said Schlussel. "Waiting for me? Let them come here. I must see them here," I cried as I gave the last strokes to the mysterious personage. He lived. His figure, foreshortened on the wall, stood out on the white background with a lifelike vigor that was startling. The jailer, without waiting to remonstrate or to make any observations, disappeared. In a few minutes he returned, accompanied by the two judges. They seemed speechless with amazement. But I, pointing to my sketch on the wall and trembling in every limb, cried out, "There is your assassin!" Von Sprechtel, after a moment's silence, asked, "His name?" "I have no idea, but he at this moment is in the market. He is cutting up meat in the third stall to the left as you enter from Trabas Street." "What do you think?" he asked his colleague. "Let the man be sent for," said Richter gravely. The order was obeyed by some officers who had remained without the cell. The judges remained standing to examine the sketch more minutely. Von Sprechtel especially seemed to take the deepest interest in it. I dropped down on my pile of straw and rested my head on my knees, quite exhausted. It was not long before we heard approaching steps in the archway. Those who have never awaited the hour of deliverance and counted the minutes, which then seemed of interminable length, those who have never experienced the harrowing emotions of doubt, hope, terror, and despair, such as they can have no conception of my feelings at this moment. I should have distinguished the step of the murderer, though surrounded by 1,000 others. They approached. The judges themselves could not conceal a certain nervous agitation. I looked up and fixed my eyes upon the door. It opened, and the man entered. His face was flushed, and his jaws were convulsively pressed together, while his little gray, restless eyes looked wildly about from under his heavy reddish brows. Von Sprechtel silently pointed to the sketch. This brawny man had looked at it but for a moment, when the color left his cheeks, and uttering a cry that sent a thrill of horror through us all, he extended his strong arms as though he would sweep aside every obstacle that hindered his escape, and sprang toward the door. A terrible struggle in the corridor ensued. You could hear nothing but the heavy breathing of the butcher, his muttered imprecations, an occasional cry of the guards, and the shuffling of their feet on the flagstones. It was brief, however, for scarcely more than a minute had elapsed when the assassin re-entered, his chin on his chest, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands secured behind his back. He looked up again at the sketch, seemed to reflect for a moment, and then, like one thinking aloud, he muttered, "Who could have seen me? At midnight?" I was saved. Many years have passed since this terrible adventure. Thank heaven, I make no more silhouettes, nor do I paint the portraits of burgomasters. By hard work and perseverance I have conquered a place, and I earn my living honorably by producing works of art, the only object, in my opinion, a veritable artist should ever have in view. But every circumstance connected with the nocturnal sketch has always remained fresh in my memory. Sometimes, in the midst of my work, my thoughts wander back to the days I spent in Rapp's garret, to the deprivations and humiliations I experienced there. Then I lay down my palette and dream often for hours. But how a crime committed by a man I had never known, at a place I had never seen, could be pictured by my pencil, even to the most unimportant details, is something I have never been able to comprehend. Was it accident? No. And then, what is accident? Is it anything else than an effect produced by a cause of which we are ignorant? May not Schiller be right when he says, "The soul is not affected by the decay of matter. When the body sleeps, it spreads its radiant wings and goes to heaven knows where." What it then does, no one can know, but inspiration sometimes betrays the secret of its nocturnal wanderings. Who knows? Nature is more audacious in her realities than man's imagination in its loftiest flights. The Dean's Watch. The day before the Christmas of 1832, my friend Wilfred, his double bass slung over his shoulder, and I, with violin under my arm, were on our way from the Black Forest to Heidelberg. An extraordinary quantity of snow had fallen that season. As far as our eyes could see over the great desert plain before us, not a trace of the route, either of road or path, was to be discovered. The north wind whistled its shrill aria about our ears with a monotonous persistence, and Wilfred, with wallet flattened against his thin back, his long heron legs stretched to the utmost, and the visor of his little flat cap pulled down over his nose, strode along before me, humming a gay air from Undine. Every now and then he turned his head with a grim smile and cried, "Comrade, play me the waltz from Robin, I wish to dance." A peal of laughter always followed, and then the brave fellow would push on again with fresh courage. I toiled on behind in his footsteps, with the snow up to my knees, and my spirits sinking lower and lower every moment. The heights about Heidelberg had begun to appear on the distant horizon, and we were hoping to reach the town before nightfall when we heard the gallop of a horse behind us. It was about 5 o'clock, and great flakes of snow were whirling about in the gray light. Soon the rider was within 20 steps. He slackened his pace, examining us out of one corner of his eye. We also examined him. Imagine a big man with red beard and hair, wrapped in a brown cloak over which was loosely thrown a pelisse of fox-skins. On his head a superb cocked hat, his hands buried in fur gloves reaching to the elbows. On the croup of his stout stallion was straddled a well-filled valise. Evidently he was some burly sheriff or burgomaster. "Hey, my lads!" he cried, drawing one of his big hands from the muff which hung across his saddle-bow, and clapping his charger's neck. "We're going to Heidelberg, I see, to try a little music." Wilfred eyed the traveler askance. "Is that any affair of yours, sir?" he answered gruffly. Yes, I should have a piece of advice to give you." "Well, you can keep it till it's asked for," retorted Wilfred, quickening his pace. I cast a second glance at our new companion. He looked exactly like a great cat, with ears standing out from his head, his eyelids half closed, and a long bristling mustache. Altogether he had a sort of purring paternal air. "My friend," he began again, this time addressing me, "the best thing you can do is to return whence you came." "Why, sir?" "The famous Maestro Ponenti from Novara has announced a grand Christmas concert at Heidelberg. Everybody is going to it. You will not get a single kreutzer." This was too much for Wilfred. "A fig for your maestro and all the Ponentis in the world," he cried, snapping his fingers. "This lad here, with his long curls and blue eyes, and not a hair yet on his chin, is worth an army of your Italian charlatans. Though he never played outside the Black Forest, he can handle a bow with the first musician in Europe, and will draw melody from his violin such as was never heard before in Heidelberg." "Hear, hear!" cried the stranger. "It is just as I tell you," said Wilfred, blowing on his fingers, which were red with the cold. Then he set out to run, and I followed him as best I might, thinking he wished to make game of the traveler who kept up with us, however, at a little trot. In this way we went on in silence for more than half a league. Suddenly the stranger cried out in a harsh voice, "Whatever your talents may be, go back to the Black Forest. We have vagabonds enough in Heidelberg already without you. It is good advice I give you. You had best profit by it." Wilfred was about to make an angry retort, but the rider had started off at a gallop, and already reached the grand avenue of the Elector. At the same moment a great flock of crows rose from the plain and seemed to follow him, filling the air with their loud cries. About 7 o'clock in the evening we reached Heidelberg. There, in fact, we found posted on all the walls in Ponenti's flaming placards, "Grand Concert, Solo," etc., etc. We wandered about among the different ale-houses, in which we met several musicians from the Black Forest, all old comrades of ours, who immediately engaged us to play in their band. There were old Bremer, the violoncellist, his two sons, Ludwig and Karl, capital second violins, Heinrich Siebel, the clarinet player, and Big Bertha with her harp. Wilfred, with his bass viol, and myself as first violin, made up the troupe. It was agreed that we should all go together, make one purse, and divide after Christmas. Wilfred had already engaged a room for himself and me. It was on the 6th story of the little tavern Sheepsfoot, in the middle of the Holdegrasse, and was only a garret, though luckily it had a sheet-iron stove in which we lighted a fire to dry ourselves. While we were sitting quietly over the fire, roasting chestnuts and discussing a pot of wine, who should come tripping up the stairs and knock at the door but little Annette, the maid of the inn, in scarlet petticoat and black velvet bodice, with cheeks like roses and lips as red as cherries. Next moment she had thrown herself into my arms with a cry of joy. We were old friends, the pretty Annette and I, for we were both from the same village, and to say truth, my heart had long been captive to her bright eyes and coquettish airs. "I saw you go up just now," she said, drawing a stool to my side, "and here I am, come for a minute's talk with you." With that she began such a string of questions about this one and that, in fact about everyone in our village, that I declare to you it was as much as I could do to answer the half of them. Every little while she would stop and look at me with such a tender air. We would have been there till this time had not suddenly Mother Gretel Dick screamed from the bottom of the stairs, "Annette! Annette! Are you ever coming?" "This minute, madam, this minute," cried the poor child, jumping up in a fright. She gave me a little pat on the cheek and flew to the door. But just as she was going out, she stopped. "Ah," she cried, turning back, "I forgot to tell you. Have you heard?" "What?" "The death of our prorector Zahn." "Well, what is that to us?" "Ah, yes, but take care, sir, take care. If your papers are not all right. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock they will come to ask for them. They have arrested, so many people during the last 2 weeks. The pro-rector was assassinated yesterday evening in the library at the cloister of St. Christopher. Last week the old priest, Olmet Elias, who lived in the Jews' quarter, was killed in the same way. Only a few days before that they murdered the nurse, Christina Haas, and Seligman, the agate merchant of the Durlachstrasse. So, my poor Caspar, she added with a tender glance, take good care of yourself, and be sure that your papers are all right. All the while she was speaking, the cries below continued. "Annette! Oh, Annette, will you come? Oh, the miserable creature to leave me here all alone!" And now, too, we could hear the shouts of the guests in the saloon calling for wine, beer, ham, sausages. Annette saw that she must go and ran down the stairs as quickly as she had come up. Mon Dieu, I heard her soft voice answering her mistress. What can be the matter, madam, that you should make such an outcry? One would think that the house was on fire. Wilfred closed the door after her and came back to his seat. We looked at each other with some uneasiness. "This is strange news," said he at last. "At any rate, your papers are all in order?" "Certainly," I replied, and showed him my pass. "Good. There is mine. I had it viséed before we left. But still, all these murders bode no good to us. I am afraid we shall make but a poor business here. Many families must be in mourning, and then, besides all these annoyances, the trouble which the police will give us." "Bah!" cried I. "You take too dismal a view of everything." We continued to talk about these strange events until long past midnight. The fire in our little stove lighted up the angles of the roof. The square dormer window with its 3 cracked panes of glass, the mattress spread upon the bare boards, the blackened beams overhead, the little fur table which cast an unsteady shadow on the worm-eaten floor. A mouse, attracted by the heat, darted back and forth like an arrow along the wall. We could hear the wind without, whistling and bellowing around the high chimney stacks, sweeping the snow from the gutters beneath the caves in misty swirls. I was dreaming of Annette. Silence had fallen upon us. Suddenly, Wilfred, throwing off his coat, cried, "It is time to sleep. Put another stick of wood in the stove and let us go to bed." "Yes, that is the best thing we can do," said I, and began to pull off my boots. 2 minutes afterward we were stretched on the mattress, the coverings drawn up to our chins, and a great log under our heads for a pillow. Wilfred was asleep in a moment. The light from the little stove blazed up and died away. The wind redoubled its violence without, and, in the midst of dreams of Annette, I too, in my turn, slept the sleep of the just. About 2 o'clock in the morning I was awakened by a strange noise. At first I thought it was a cat running along the gutters, but, my ear being close to the rafters, I could not remain long in doubt. Someone was walking over the roof. I touched Wilfred with my elbow to awaken him. "Hist!" whispered he, pressing my hand. He also had heard the noise. The fire was just dying out. The last feeble flame flickered on the crumbling walls. I was on the point of springing from the bed when, at a single blow, the little window, kept closed by a fragment of brick, was pushed open. A pale face with red hair, eyes gleaming with phosphorescent light, and quivering cheeks, appeared in the opening and looked about the room. Our fright was so great that we could not utter a sound. The man passed first one leg, then the other through the window, and descended into the garret so carefully that not a board creaked under his footsteps. This man, with heavy round shoulders, short and thick-set, his face wrinkled and set like a tiger crouched to spring, was none other than the rider who had overtaken us on the road to Heidelberg. But what a change in his appearance since then! In spite of the excessive cold, he was in his shirt-sleeves, a pair of breeches belted about his waist, woolen stockings, and shoes with silver buckles. A long knife, flecked with blood, glittered in his hand. Wilfred and I gave ourselves up for lost, but he did not seem to see us under the shadow of the sloping roof, although the fire was fanned again into a blaze by the current of cold air from the open window. The intruder seated himself on a stool, cowering and shivering in a strange way. Suddenly his greenish-yellow eyes fixed themselves on me, his nostrils dilated. For more than a minute, which seemed to me an age, he stared at me. The blood stood still in my veins. Then at last, turning toward the fire, he coughed with a husky, hoarse sound, like that which a cat makes, without moving a muscle of his face. Drawing a watch from the fob of his pantaloons, he seemed to look at the hour, and then, whether from absence of mind or some other reason, I know not, laid it upon the table. At length, rising from his seat with an air of uncertainty, he looked toward the window, appeared for a moment to hesitate, and then passed out of the door, leaving it wide open behind him. I jumped up to shove the bolt, but already the man's steps were creaking on the staircase 2 stories below. An irresistible curiosity overcame my terror. I heard a window open which looked upon the court, and, in a moment, I was at the dormer and the landing of the stairs on the same side. The court, seen from this height, was like a deep well. A wall 50 or 60 feet high divided it into 2 parts. On the right was the court of a pork butcher, on the left that of the sheep's foot. The wall was covered with moss and the rank vegetation which flourishes in the shade. Its summit reached from the window which the marauder had just opened in a straight line to the roof of a great gloomy building in the rear of the Bergstrasse. All this I took in at a glance, as the moon shone out from among the heavy snow-laden clouds, and I trembled as I saw the man come out through the window and fly along the top of this wall, his head bent forward, the long knife in his hand, while the wind whistled and wailed a dismal chorus. He gained the roof in front and disappeared through a window. I believed I must be dreaming. For several moments I remained with open mouth, my breast bare and my hair blown about the wind and wet by the sleet which fell from the eaves. At last, waking from my stupor, I returned to our garret, and found Wilfred with face blanched and haggard with fright, and muttering a prayer under his breath. I hastened to bolt the door, throw some wood into the stove, and slip on my clothes. "Well?" asked my comrade, getting out of bed. "Well," I replied, "we are safe this time. If that man did not see us, it was only because heaven was not ready yet for us to die." "Yes," he murmured. "Yes, it is one of the assassins Annette told us about. Good heavens, what a face, and what a knife!" He fell back on the mattress. I swallowed what was left of the wine in the pitcher, and as the fire was now burning brightly, filling the room with its heat, and the bolt seemed a strong one, I began to regain my courage. Still, the watch was there. The man might return to look for it. Our fears awoke again at this idea. "What is to be done now?" asked Wilfred. "Our shortest plan will be to go back at once to the Black Forest. I have no wish to play any more double bass. You can do as you choose." "But why? What should make us go back? We have done no crime." "Hush! Speak low," whispered he. "The word crime alone is enough to hang us, if anyone heard. Poor devils like us serve as examples for others. Were they only to find this watch here." "Come, Wilfred," said I. "It is no use to lose one's head. I dare say a crime has been committed last night in the neighborhood. It is more than probable, but instead of flying, an honest man should aid justice. He should—" "But how aid it? How?" "The simplest way will be to take the watch tomorrow to the provost and tell him what has taken place." "Never, never! I would not dare touch the watch." "Very well, I will go myself. Come, let us go to bed again." "No, I cannot sleep any more." "As you will. Light your pipe then, and let us talk." As soon as day dawned, I took the watch from the table. It was a very fine one, with 2 dials, one for the hours, the other for the minutes. Wilfred seemed, however, by this time to have regained his assurance. "Caspar," he said, "all things considered, it will be better for me to go to the provost. You are too young for such a piece of business. You will not be able to explain properly." "Just as you choose," I replied. "Besides, it would seem strange for a man of my age to send a child." "Oh, yes, Wilfred, I understand." I saw that his self-esteem had driven him to this resolution. He would have been ashamed to own to his comrades that he had shown less courage than I. He took the watch, and we descended the stairs with grave faces. Passing through the alley which leads to the street St. Christopher, we heard the clinking of glasses and knives and forks. At the same time I recognized the voices of old Bremer and his 2 sons. "Faith, Wilfred," said I, "a good glass of wine would not be bad before we go out." I pushed open the door into the saloon. All our friends were there. Violins and horns hung upon the walls, the harp in one corner. They received us with joyful cries of welcome, and made us take seats at the table. "Heh!" cried old Bremer. "Good luck, comrades. See the snow and the wind. The saloons will all be full. Every flake of snow in the air is a florin in our pockets." The sight of my little Annette, as fresh and piquant as ever, smiling on me with eyes and lips full of love, gave me new spirits. The best pieces of ham were for me, and every time that she came to set down a glass near me, her hand would tenderly press my shoulder. Ah, how my heart beat as I thought of the nuts which we had cracked together the night before. Still, the pale face of the assassin would pass from time to time before my eyes, making me shudder at the recollection. I looked at Wilfred. He was grave and thoughtful. As 8 o'clock struck, we all rose to go, when suddenly the door opened, and 3 mean-looking fellows with leaden faces and eyes sharp as rats, followed by several more of the same sort, presented themselves on the threshold. One of them, with a long nose which seemed to be on the scent for some mischief, a great cudgel in his fist, advanced with the demand, "Your papers, gentlemen." Everyone hastened to satisfy him. Unhappily, however, Wilfred, who was standing near the stove, was seized with a sudden fit of trembling, and, as he saw the practiced eye of the police agent regarding him with an equivocal look, the unlucky idea occurred to him of letting the watch slip down into his boot. Before it reached its destination, however, the officer stepped up to him, and slapping him on the leg, cried in a bantering tone, "Aha! Something seems to trouble you here." Upon this, Wilfred, to the consternation of all, succumbed entirely. He fell back upon a bench as pale as death, and Madoc, the chief of police, with a malicious shout of laughter, drew forth the watch from his pantaloons. But the moment the agent looked at it, he became grave. "Let no one go out," he thundered to his followers. "We've the whole gang here. 'Tis watch of the Dean, Daniel Vanderburg. Quick, the handcuffs." Thereupon arose a terrible tumult. Giving ourselves up for lost, I slipped down under the bench close to the wall. In spite of their protests, poor old Bremer, his sons, and Wilfred were all handcuffed. Just then I felt a soft little hand pass gently about my neck. It was Annette's, and I pressed my lips upon it as a last adieu, when seizing my ear she pulled it gently, gently. Under one end of the table I saw the cellar door open. I slipped through, the trap door closed. All had passed in a second. In my hiding place I heard them trampling over the door. Then everything was still. My unlucky comrades were gone. Without, on the doorstep, I heard Mother Gretel Dick lamenting in shrill tones the dishonor which had fallen on the sheep's foot. All day long I remained squeezed behind a hogshead, with back bent and legs doubled under me, a prey to 1,000 fears. Should a dog stray into the cellar, should the landlady take a fancy to refill the jug herself, or a fresh cask have to be broached, the least chance might be my destruction. I imagined old Bremer and his sons, Wilfred, Big Bertha herself, all hanging from the gibbet on the Harburg, in the middle of a great flock of crows that were feasting at their expense. My hair stood on end. Annette, as anxious as myself, carefully closed the door each time she left the cellar. "Leave the door alone," I heard the old woman say. "Are you a fool to lose half your time in opening it?" After that the door remained open. I saw the tables surrounded by new guests, who discussed in loud tones the doings of the famous band of murderers who had just been captured, and exulted over the fate in store for them. All the musicians from the Black Forest, they said, were bandits who made a pretense of their trade to find their way into houses and spy out the bolts and bars, and then next morning the master would be found murdered in his bed, the mistress and children with their throats cut. They ought all to be exterminated without pity. "All the town will go to see them hanged," cried Mother Gretel. "It will be the happiest day of my life. And to think that the watch of Master Daniel was the means of their capture. He told the police of its loss and gave them a description of it this morning, and an hour after Madoc bagged the whole covey." Thereupon followed shouts of laughter and triumph. Shame, indignation, terror made me hot and cold by turns. Night came at last. All the drinkers had gone save 2 or 3 who still lingered over their cups. A single candle remained lighted in the saloon. "Go to bed, madam," said Annette's soft voice to Mother Gretel. "I will stay till these gentlemen go." The carousers, tipsy as they were, understood the hint and took their leave one by one. At last, thought I, as I heard the last one go, stumbling and hiccoughing through the door. They are all gone. Mother Gretel will go to bed. Annette will come without delay to deliver me. In this agreeable anticipation I had already disentangled my numb limbs when these dreadful words of the portly landlady met my ears. "Annette, go and close up, and do not forget the bar. I'm going myself into the cellar." Alas, this seemed to be the praiseworthy, but for me most unlucky custom of the good lady, so as to see herself that all was right. "But, madam," stammered Annette, "there is no need. The cask is not empty." "Mind your own business," interrupted her mistress, whose candle already was shining at the top of the steps. I had hardly time to crouch again behind the cask. The old woman went from one cask to the other, stooping beneath the low ceiling of the vault. "Oh, the hussy!" I heard her mutter. "How she lets the wine leak out! But only wait! I will teach her to close the stopcocks better. Just to see, just to see!" The light cast dark shadows on the walls glistening with moisture. I made myself as small as possible. Suddenly, just as I thought the danger over, I heard a sigh from the stout dame, a sigh so long, so lugubrious, that it struck me at once. Something extraordinary must have happened. I risked a look. To my horror, I saw Mother Gretel with open mouth and eyes starting from her head, staring at the ground beneath the cask behind which I was crouching motionless. She had espied one of my feet, projecting beneath the joist which supported the hogshead. No doubt she thought that she had discovered the chief of the brigands, hidden there for the purpose of cutting her throat during the night. My resolution was taken quickly. Rising up, I said in a low voice, "Madam, for heaven's sake, have pity on me. I am—" But thereupon, without listening, without even looking at me, she began to scream like any peacock, the shrillest, the most ear-piercing screams, and at the same time to clamber up the stairs as fast as her fat body would let her. Almost beside myself with terror, I clung to her robe, fell on my knees beside her. But this was worse still. "Help! Help! Assassins! Murder!" she shrieked. Oh, let me go! Take my money! Oh!" It was frightful. "Look at me, madam," I tried to say. "I am not what you think." But she was crazy with fear. She raved, she gasped, she bawled at the top of her lungs, so that, had we not been underground, the whole quarter would have been aroused. In despair and furious at her stupid folly, I clambered over her back and gained the door before her, slammed it in her face, and shoved the bolt. During the struggle, the light had been extinguished, and Mistress Gretel remained in the dark, her voice only faintly heard at intervals. Exhausted, almost annihilated, I looked at Annette, whose distress was equal to mine. We stood listening in silence to the faint cries. Gradually they died away and ceased. The poor woman must have fainted. "Oh, Caspar," cried Annette, clasping her hands, "what is to be done? Fly! Save yourself! Have you killed her?" "Killed her? I?" "No matter. Fly! Here, quick!" And she drew the bar from before the street door. I rushed into the street without even thanking her. Ungrateful wretch that I was. The night was black as ink, not a star to be seen, not a lamp lighted, snow driving before the wind. I ran on for half an hour at least before I stopped to take a breath. I looked up. Imagine my despair. There I was, right in front of the Sheep's Foot again. In my terror I had made the tour of the quarter, perhaps 2 or 3 times for aught I knew. My legs were like lead, my knees trembled. The inn, but just before deserted, was buzzing like a beehive. Lights went on from window to window. It was full, no doubt, of police agents. Exhausted with hunger and fatigue, desperate, not knowing where to find refuge, I took the most singular of all my resolutions. "Faith," said I to myself, "one death as well as another. It is no worse to be hung than to leave one's bones on the road to the Black Forest. Here goes." And I entered the inn to deliver myself up to justice. Besides the shabby men with crushed hats and big sticks whom I had already seen in the morning, who were going and coming and prying everywhere, before a table were seated the Grand Provost Zimmer, dressed all in black, solemn, keen-eyed, and the Secretary Roth with his red wig, imposing smile, and great flat ears like oyster shells. They paid hardly any attention at all to me, a circumstance which at once modified my resolution. I took a seat in one corner of the hall behind the great stove, in company with 2 or 3 of the neighbors who had run in to see what was going on, and called calmly for a pint of wine and a plate of sauerkraut. Annette came near, betraying me. "Ah, good heavens!" she exclaimed. "Is it possible that you are here?" But luckily no one noticed her exclamation, and I ate my meal with better appetite and listened to the examination of the good Lady Gretel, who sat propped up in a big armchair with hair disheveled and eyes still dilated by her fright. "Of what age did this man seem to be?" asked the provost. 40 or 50, sir. It was an immense man, with black whiskers, or brown, I don't know exactly which, and a long nose and green eyes." "Had he no marks of any kind? Scars, for instance?" "No, I can't remember. Luckily I screamed so loud he was frightened, and then I defended myself with my nails. He had a great hammer and pistols. He seized me by the throat. You know, sir, when one tries to murder you, you have to defend yourself." "Nothing more natural, more legitimate, my dear madam. Right, Monsieur Roth. The courage and presence of mind of this excellent lady were truly admirable." Then came Annette's turn, who simply declared that she had been so frightened she could remember nothing. "This will do," said the provost. "If further inquiry is necessary, we will return tomorrow." The examination being thus ended, everyone departed, and I asked Madame Gretel to give me a room for the night. She did not in the least recollect ever having seen me before. "Annette," she gasped, "take the gentleman to the little green room in the 3rd story. As for myself, sir, you see I cannot even stand on my legs. Oh, good Lord, what does not one have to go through in this world?" With this she fell to sobbing, which seemed to relieve her. "Oh, Casper, Casper," cried Annette, when she had taken me to my room and we were alone, "who would have believed that you were one of the band? I can never, never forgive myself for having loved a brigand." "How? Annette, you too?" I exclaimed. "This is too much." "No, no," she cried, throwing her arms around my neck. "You are not one of them. You are too good for that. Still, you are a brave man just the same, to have come back." I explained to her that I should have died of cold outside, and that this alone had decided me. After a few minutes, however, we parted so as not to arouse Mother Gretel's suspicions, and having made certain that none of the windows opened on a wall, and that the bolt on the door was a good one, I went to bed, and soon was fast asleep. 2. When I drew the curtain of my bed next morning, I saw that the window panes were white with snow, which was heaped up also on the sill without. I thought mournfully of my poor comrades' fate. How they must have suffered from cold. Old Bremer and Big Bertha especially. My heart ached for them. While I was absorbed in these sad reflections, a strange noise arose outside. It drew near the inn, and not without fear and trembling I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window to see what new danger threatened. They were bringing the terrible band to confront it with Madame Gretel Dick. My poor companions came down the street between 2 files of policemen, and followed by a perfect avalanche of ragamuffins, yelling and hissing like true savages. There was poor Bremer, handcuffed to his son Ludwig, then Karl and Wilfred, and last of all, stout Bertha, who walked by herself, lamenting her fate all the while in heart-rending tones. "For heaven's sake, gentlemen, for heaven's sake, have pity on a poor innocent harpist. I kill, I rob? Oh, good Lord, can it be possible?" And she wrung her hands. The others looked doleful enough as they walked with heads bent and disheveled hair hanging over their faces. The procession, rabble and all, turned into the dark alley which led to the inn. Presently the guards drove out the eager crowd, who remained outside in the mud, with their noses flattened against the window panes. I dressed myself quickly and opened my door to see if there were not some chance of escape. But I could hear voices and footsteps going to and fro downstairs, and made up my mind that the passages were well guarded. My door opened on the landing, just opposite the window which our midnight visitor of the night before must have used in his flight. At first I paid no attention to this window, but while I remained listening, on a sudden I perceived that it was open, that there was but little snow on the sill, and drawing near I perceived that there were fresh tracks along the wall. I shuddered at this discovery. The man had been there again. Perhaps he came every night. The cat, the weasel, the ferret, all such beasts of prey have their accustomed paths in this way. In a moment everything was clear in my mind. Ah, thought I, if chance has thus put the assassin's fate in my hands, my poor comrades may be saved. Just at this moment the door of the saloon was opened, and I could hear some words of the examination going on. "Do you admit having participated, on the 20th of this month, in the assassination of the priest Olmet Elias?" Then followed some words which I could not make out, and the door was closed again. I leaned my head on the baluster, debating in my mind a heroic resolution. Heaven has put the fate of my companions in my hands. I can save them. If I recoil from such a duty, I shall be their murderer. My peace of mind, my honor, will be gone forever. I shall feel myself the most contemptible of men. For a long time I hesitated, but all at once my resolution was taken. I descended the stairs and made my way into the hall. "Have you never seen this watch?" the provost was saying to Gretel. "Try to recollect, madam." Without awaiting her answer, I advanced and replied myself in a firm voice. "This watch, sir, I have seen in the hands of the assassin himself. I recognize it, and I can deliver the assassin into your hands this very night, if you will but listen to me." Profound silence for a moment followed my address. The astounded officials looked at each other. My comrades seemed to revive a little. "Who are you, sir?" demanded the provost, recovering himself. "I am the comrade of these unfortunate men, and I am not ashamed to own it," I cried. "For all of them, though poor, are honest. Not one of them is capable of committing the crime they are accused of." Once more there was silence. The great Bertha began to sob under her breath. The provost seemed to reflect. At last, looking at me sternly, he said, "Where do you pretend you will find the assassin for us?" "Here, sir, in this house. And to convince you, I only ask to speak one moment to you in private." "Come," said he, rising. He motioned to the chief detective, Madoc, to follow us, and we went out. I ran quickly upstairs, the others close behind me. On the third story, I stopped before the window and pointed out the tracks in the snow. "There are the assassin's footsteps," said I. "This is where he passes every evening. Night before last he came in at 2 o'clock in the morning. Last night he was here. No doubt he will return tonight." The provost and Madoc looked at the footsteps for several moments without saying a word. "And how do you know these are the footsteps of the murderer?" asked the chief of police incredulously. I told them about the man's entrance into our garret, and pointed out above the lattice through which I had watched his flight in the moonlight. It was only by accident, I said, that I had discovered the footsteps this morning. "Strange," muttered the provost. "This modifies considerably the position of the prisoners. But how do you explain the murderer's being in the cellar?" "The murderer was myself, sir," and I related in a few words the events of the night before. "That will do," said he, and then turning to the chief of police continued, "I must confess, Madoc, that these fiddlers' story has seemed to me by no means conclusive of their having had anything to do with the murders. Besides, their papers establish, for several of them, an alibi very hard to disprove. Still, young man, though the account you give us has the appearance of being true, you will remain in our power until it is verified. Madoc, do not lose sight of him, and take your measures accordingly." With this, he went downstairs, collected his papers, and ordered the prisoners to be taken back to jail. Then, casting a look of contempt at the corpulent landlady, he took his departure, followed by his secretary. "Madam," said Madoc, who remained with 2 of his men, "you will please preserve the most profound silence as to what has taken place. Also prepare for this brave lad here the same room he occupied the night before last." His tone admitted of no reply, and Madame Gretel promised by all that was sacred to do whatever they wished, if they would only save her from the brigands. "Give yourself no uneasiness about the brigands," replied Madoc. "We will stay here all day and all night to protect you. Go quietly about your affairs, and begin by giving us breakfast. Young man, will you do me the honor to breakfast with me?" My stipulation did not permit me to decline this offer. I accepted. We were soon seated in front of a ham and a bottle of Rhine wine. The chief of police, in spite of his leaden face, his keen eye, and great nose like the beak of an eagle, was a jolly enough fellow after a few glasses of wine. He tried to seize Annette by the waist as she passed. He told funny stories at which the others shouted with laughter. I, however, remained silent, depressed. "Come, young man," said Madoc with a laugh. "Try to forget the death of your estimable grandmother. We are all mortal. Take a good drink and chase away all these gloomy thoughts." So the time slipped away amid clouds of tobacco smoke, the jingling of glasses and clinking of cans. We sat apart during the day in one corner of the saloon. Guests came to drink as usual, but they paid no attention to us. At 9 o'clock, however, after the watchman had gone his round, Madoc rose. "Now," said he, "we must attend to our little business. Close the door and shutters. Softly, madam, softly. There, you and Mademoiselle Annette may go to bed." The chief and his 2 followers drew from their pockets bars of iron loaded at the ends with leaden balls. Madoc put a fresh cap on his pistol and placed it carefully in the breast pocket of his overcoat, so as to be ready at hand. Then we mounted to the garret. The too attentive Annette had lighted a fire in the stove. Madoc muttered an oath between his teeth, hastened to throw some water on the coals. Then he pointed to the mattress. "If you have any mind for it," said he to me, "you can sleep." He blew out the candle and seated himself with his 2 acolytes in the back part of the room against the wall. I threw myself on the bed, murmuring a prayer that heaven would send the assassin. The hours rolled by. Midnight came. The silence was so profound I could scarcely believe the 3 men sat there with eye and ear strained to catch the least movement, the slightest sound. Minute after minute passed slowly. Slowly. I could not sleep. 1,000 terrible images chased each other through my brain. 1 o'clock struck. 2. Yet nothing. No one appeared. At 3 o'clock one of the policemen moved. I thought the man was coming. But all was silent again as before. I began to think that Madoc would take me for an impostor, to imagine how he would abuse me in the morning. And then my poor comrades. Instead of aiding, I had only riveted their chains. The time seemed now to pass only too rapidly. I wished the night might last forever, so as to preserve at least a ray of hope for me. I was going over the same torturing fancies for the 100th time, when, on a sudden, without my having heard the least sound, the window opened. 2 eyes gleamed in the aperture. Nothing moved in the garret. "They have gone to sleep," thought I, in an agony of suspense. The head remained there, motionless, watchful. The villain must suspect something. Oh, how my heart thumped! The blood coursed through my veins, and yet cold beads of sweat gathered on my forehead. I ceased to breathe. Several minutes passed thus. Then, suddenly, the man seemed to have decided. He glided down into the garret, with the same noiseless caution as on the previous night. But at that same instant a cry, a terrible, short, thrilling cry, vibrated through the room. "We have him!" Then the whole house was shaken from garret to cellar by cries, the stamping of feet, hoarse shouts. I was petrified by terror. The man bellowed, the others drew their breaths in quick gasps. Then came a heavy fall which made the floor crack, and I heard only the gnashing of teeth and clink of chains. "Light!" cried the terrible Madoc. By the flame of the burning coals, which cast a bluish light through the room, I could dimly see the police officers crouched over the body of a man in his shirt sleeves. One held him by the throat. The knees of the other rested upon his chest. Madoc was roughly clasping the handcuffs on his wrists. The man lay as if lifeless, save that from time to time one of his great legs, naked from knee to ankle, was raised, and struck the floor with a convulsive movement. His eyes were starting from their sockets. A blood-stained foam had gathered upon his lips. Hardly had I lighted the candle when the officers started back with an exclamation. "Ardine!" And all 3 rose to their feet, looking at each other with pale faces. The bloodshot eye of the assassin turned toward Madoc. His lips moved, but only after several seconds I could hear him murmur, "What a dream! Good God, what a dream!" Then a sigh, and he lay motionless again. I drew near to look at him. Yes, it was he, the man who had overtaken us on the road to Heidelberg and advised us to turn back. Perhaps even then he had a presentiment that we would be the cause of his ruin. Madoc, who had recovered from his surprise, seeing that he did not move, and that a thread of blood was oozing along the dusty floor, bent over him and tore asunder the bosom of his shirt. He had stabbed himself to the heart with his huge knife. "Eh?" said Madoc with a sinister smile. "Monsieur the Dean has cheated the gallows. He knew where to strike, and has not missed his mark. Do you stay here," he continued to us. "I will go and inform the provost." I remained with the 2 police agents watching the corpse. By 8 o'clock next morning, all Heidelberg was electrified with the news. Daniel Vanderberg, dean of the woolen drapers, possessed of wealth and position such as few enjoyed. Who could believe that he had been the terrible assassin? 100 different explanations were offered. Some said the rich dean had been a somnambulist, and therefore not responsible for his actions. Others, that he had murdered from pure love of blood. He could have had no other motive for such a crime. Perhaps both theories were true. In the somnambulist, the will is dead. He is governed by his animal instincts alone, be they pacific or sanguinary. And in Master Daniel Vanderberg, the cruel face, the flat head swollen behind the ears, the green eyes, the long bristling mustache, all proved that he unhappily belonged to the feline family, terrible race which kills for the pleasure of killing.